As many of us know, in just 2 days we're going to roll in the new year. And while there really isn't any difference between December 31st, 2018 and January 1st, 2019, in our minds with the new year, something happens, right? I mean, there's something about the new year that kind of energizes us, right? I mean, somehow the new year, we look at it, we think the new year is going to bring new opportunities. The new year is going to bring new expectations, new desires. And so we start making plans, don't we? How many of you have made plans for 2019? Don't have many plan makers in here this morning, do I? We have a few, okay. I honestly figured that more of you would raise your hand. But some of you have made plans. Maybe some of you are currently in the middle of making plans. If you haven't made plans, there's apparently like 75% of this church this morning. I would imagine that at some point, or right now actually, you're planning on making plans for 2019. And we'll make plans for all types of things, won't we? Plans for vacation, plans for work, plans for purchasing a car, purchasing a home, plans for the family, plans for finances. We make plans for date nights and friend and family gatherings. We make plans for meals throughout the week. And you may not have thought about it this way, but this morning, whether you realize it or not, this morning you fulfilled a plan that you had in your mind. You planned on coming to church this morning. Either that or God woke you up and said, get on in. But I imagine, we got one saying, I testify, that's happened. No, but more than likely you made plans to come here. You set your alarm and said, I'm going to get up at this time and get ready and go and be at church this morning. The fact is, we are a people who make plans, and though you haven't yet, you will. Whether short-term or long-term, it's essentially unavoidable. So as Christians, we almost have to ask the question, when we make plans, where does God come in? Where does God come into all these self-made plans? I imagine that there are times that we make plans, possibly even for the next year, for the new year, and we don't really look at some kind of God aspect to them. We just make plans. I mean, we don't think about, okay, I'm going to go on make plans for vacation. How do I invite God into these plans? We don't typically think about that, do we? We just kind of say, I'm going to go on vacation. The beach sounds good. Let's hit the road. But as Christians, every facet of our lives is somehow connected, somehow tied to God and our spiritual lives, and that would most certainly include our plans. So again, when we're making plans, where does God come in? Where does God play into our plans? Solomon writes about this, or I believe Solomon writes about this anyways, in Proverbs 16 verses 1 and 2. He says this, he says, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. If we look at these two verses here, we see a parallel throughout it. Each verse begins, so like verse 1 begins with man, verse 2 begins with man, and both verses end with God. There's almost a comparison of sorts that takes place. So let's just break this down for a moment, looking at the man side of things, and then we'll get to the God side of things this morning. Solomon begins by saying the plans of the heart belong to man. In other words, basically what Solomon is saying is, hey, we make plans. It's something we are bound to do. And there's a pretty good reason why we do this. We learn right in the beginning of the book of Genesis that we are made in the image of God. And if you read just a little bit further into the book of Genesis, you can see that God is a God who makes plans. It's a good thing for us because His plans is what has given us our salvation. So being made in the image of God, having the mind of God, we are going to make plans. Plans are normal. Plans are necessary. And then in verse 2, here's where it kind of gets to really our heart. Solomon says this, he adds another aspect. He says, all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes. Now Solomon doesn't specifically mention plans in verse 2, but if you look at this, plans are certainly part of the ways that he is mentioning here. So the idea is relevant to our plans, that our plans are pure in the eyes of man. And typically speaking, as Solomon points out, we think our ways, we think our plans are pure, don't we? How many of us make plans and say, man, that's a terrible plan? Maybe some of us do. I probably have before. But we look at our plans and we say, man, our plans are pure, our plans are right. We're partial to them, aren't we? I think that's why we get so, how many of you have ever had a plan go wrong and you got upset about it? So here we're looking at this. Nobody makes plans, so we don't have plans go wrong. That's how it goes. Yeah. No, we do, don't we? Like plans go wrong. We're partial to our plans. We think our plans are pure. We think our plans are right. And so when our plans don't go according to what we thought they should, or how we kind of mapped it out, things would go, we kind of get upset about it sometimes, don't we? We make plans to go here or go there, do this or do that. We kind of get upset when our plans don't go our way. And because we feel so sure about our plans, we aren't typically quick to make changes to our plans, are we? You ever had someone come in and tell you that you should do this, that you should change your plan somehow or another? Like you tell them, hey, here's my plan. They say, I don't know if I do that. We got a couple. I'm not sure which one made it, but one of the husband or the wife, one of them's telling the other, that's a terrible plan. maybe the person who told you that is in your own home. And when we make plans and someone will come along and say, no, I think this is probably better right. And because we think our plans are so right, because we think our plans are so pure, we think our plans are like foolproof kind of deal, we're not quick to make changes, are we? Someone says, you know what, this probably might help you out a little bit. And we say, I've thought longer and harder about this than you have. I'm going to do things my way. In our eyes, if we make plans, they're great plans. They're pure. They're right. Yet Solomon points out throughout these two verses the truth we likely already know. We make plans as both a normal and necessary part of life, and we think our plans are grand. But Solomon says the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. The answer of the tongue is from the Lord. And the Lord weighs the spirit of our plans, our ways. In other words, God is able to look at our plans both inside and out and from every facet imaginable and beyond our what we can imagine. So God sees the parts of our plans we cannot see. He sees the motives deep within that we can't even begin to understand. God sees the present and God sees the future. And when all is said and done, Solomon says the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. In other words, God is going to have the last word. God is going to have the last word. I believe this truth is what led James to pen these words in James chapter 4. He's talking to folks who make plans like James chapter 4 verse 13. He's talking to people who say, this next year I'm going to go to such and such a town and I'm going to make a profit. I'm going to spend a year there and I'm going to make a profit. And so James comes in, he says this in James 4, 14 and 16. He says, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? This is encouraging here. For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Like you're here and you're gone kind of thing. There's your New Year encouragement right there. We are nothing but a mist that's here and gone in the next instant. And James says instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. You see, in the eyes of James, it's boasting to make plans in the absence of God and the absence of God's will. It's boasting to make plans and think, you know what? My plans ought to work out exactly as I've made them because, again, they're pure and they're right. It's boasting to say my plans are the only way because in God's sovereign power, the answer of the tongue comes. And God is going to have a say in everything that takes place. I think this truth is wonderfully illustrated in the life of the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 16. I've always enjoyed this chapter because I look at Paul's life and what he's doing here and it makes me feel comforted in my own when my plans don't go the way I thought they ought to go. You see, Paul is currently on his second missionary journey, and in fact, though he has traveled a pretty good distance at this point, with all things considered, he's really only just begun his trip. And if we read the beginning of the first 5 verses of Acts chapter 16, you can go ahead and flip over there now. If we begin reading the first 5 verses of Acts 16, we'll see that things are going quite well. Like things are going great for Paul in his second missionary journey. Just to name a few things, Paul has picked up another disciple and companion by the name of Timothy. Have you heard of him? It's a pretty good pickup right there, isn't it? Timothy's a pretty good leader in the church, or would go on to be. Paul has been explaining to the churches the decisions of the Jerusalem Council found in Acts 15. If you don't know what that's about, go read it this week. But anyways, he's coming to them saying this is what the Jerusalem Council has decided would take place with the church. And what we find in the first 5 verses, this is actually strengthening the church. The church, their faith is growing by what Paul is telling them. And the most exciting thing, though, that we find in the first 5 verses is in verse 5. The gospel is expanding. It says the number is increasing daily. The gospel is expanding. It's not just expanding, but it's expanding rapidly. Things are going quite well. I'm sure at this point Paul is on fire. Wouldn't you be if all this is going on? The church is being strengthened in their faith. Numbers are growing each and every day. Man, you look at this and saying, man, we put together a pretty solid plan, right? Like we've done some great things. Thank you, Lord. He, along with Silas and Timothy, are likely, because of everything that's going so well, they're itching to get to the next town. They're itching to get there to spread the gospel. And in fact, I imagine they cannot wait to get there. They have a destination in mind. They have a plan in place, a plan that they believe is good and right. But as Solomon points out, the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. And so we read this in Acts 16, verses 6 through 8. And they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. You see, Paul had plans, these grand plans. We want to go into this area and we'll preach the gospel, and God had a different idea. I imagine that these plans were developed over a discussion that Paul had with Timothy and Silas. I imagine they sat down possibly by a campfire at night, or maybe as they're taking one of those long journeys on the road, he sat there and he walked and talked with Silas and Timothy and said, we're going to go here, we're going to do this. They talked about where they're going to go next, what they would do, and how they would do it. They had likely discussed this idea, let's go to Asia, let's spread the gospel in Asia, possibly even laying out this mission, this ministry approach. But notice what happens. Acts says, God forbid them to speak in Asia by the Holy Spirit. Hitting a wall, having a door slammed in their face, they look elsewhere. And the travels eventually took them to an area called Mysia. And when they got to Mysia, I imagine they discussed their next moves yet again. And looking at it from a human standpoint, the most logical place to turn next would be the region of Bithynia. If you look at a map, if your Bible has a map, you can see it. When you go to Mysia, if you go straight north, right there you are. You're in Bithynia. You don't have to go across any waters. You don't have to do much of any really difficult traveling. You just travel north. You're right there where you need to be. And if you look at Bithynia, it doesn't really seem like there's a church that's been established in the area. So in the human mind, it makes perfect sense to just travel up into that region and begin spreading the gospel. But notice what happens. They attempted to go there, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. Twice Paul expected to go a certain direction. Twice Paul's heart devised plans for their next steps in ministry. Twice Paul, probably go back one slide there, Dylan, sorry about that. Twice Paul likely believed that his plans were pure. Obviously my plans weren't great because I put a highlighted mark there where it didn't need to be. Anyways, but obviously twice Paul likely believed that his plans were pure and right, and twice God showed Paul that he didn't, that he had different plans in store. As God forbid Paul to speak in one area and didn't even allow him to go to the other. Now we don't know how Paul knew that God was preventing him from speaking. We don't know how Paul knew that God was preventing him to go into Bithynia. It could have been a vision. It could have been just a tug of the heart that he was so in tune with the Spirit that he just knew this wasn't where God was leading him. We don't know what it was. However God chose to do it, the point was clear. God was shutting doors to these areas. And I imagine that what Paul had experienced in Acts 16 isn't foreign to our experiences. In fact, just this past week, today's sermon is something that didn't go according to my plans. If you think this sermon's bad, you should have read the last one. Thursday morning, I woke up thinking I was going to preach a text on holiness, on how we need to have it's corny, okay? But here's my plans, and you'll see how bad. I was going to say, you know how we say Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year? I was going to preach a sermon about having a holy New Year. I told you it was pretty corny. Merry Christmas and a Holy New Year. It's pretty corny, I know. It's what we preachers do, or at least me. But that was my plan. I woke up and I said, you know, I'm going to preach on holiness. I'm going to preach on reaching, on striving for holiness. And at 3:30 Thursday afternoon, I quickly realized, that was not where I was going. And everything changed completely. Everything that I had been working toward all week long changed completely. Some of y'all saying, yeah, we can tell, John. It's I'm just kidding. I hope I'm kidding anyways. I don't know. But anyways, my plans changed. And I really don't think that I'm unique in this aspect. You likely made plans, and your changes, words are tough sometimes. You likely made plans, and your plans have changed before as well. How many of you, when you went to college, said, I'm going to be this right here, and it changed within the first year? Mine changed 3 times within the first week. So, how many of you said, we're going to go here for vacation, and it didn't work out that way? You made plans to do this and plans to do that, and it didn't quite go as you had imagined. God was slamming doors one way or another to direct you elsewhere. And this new year, as we make plans, the odds are extremely high that God is going to do more of the same. And we need to understand something that happens at these points. When doors are slamming on us, when God is shutting doors on us, we face one of two temptations. The first temptation is that we're going to do this. We're going to say, you know what? I keep trying. I keep putting these plans together. They keep failing. So I'm trying, and obviously I'm not getting anywhere. Obviously my plans aren't working out. So I'm just going to quit. Why bother? Sometimes we kind of have that spirit. I do want to point out to you that God never called us to be quitters, unless it's quitting sin. The second temptation, though, that we often face, and this is when we think our plans are pure and right, a little bit of pride's put in there. We're tempted to kind of dig in our heels, and we're going to find some sort of battering ram. We're going to say, God, I'm going to knock down this door. I'm going to go with my plans anyways. This is what I had in mind, and this is what I'm going to do. So we put our head down, we ignore the signs, and we keep pressing on to accomplish whatever we had in mind, no matter what. If Paul would have pressed on in this situation and decided, you know what, I'm going to go into Bithynia anyways, we don't really know what would have happened because Paul didn't do it. But one thing we do know is that Paul would have been in direct disobedience to God. In all likelihood, if Paul would have said, you know what, God, I appreciate that, but I'm going to go in here anyways, things wouldn't have gone very well for Paul in Bithynia. And I believe Paul knew that. So instead of plugging along anyways, Paul made a conscious decision. Now imagine that this decision was made at the onset of Paul's missionary journey. It's what Solomon writes about in Proverbs 16, verses 3 and 9. He says, commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. And then in verse 9, we drop down to verse 9, he says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Solomon says, commit your work to the Lord. And again, as with the word ways that we find in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 2, work here certainly implies our plans as well. After all, any work we do is essentially the product of the plans we developed. And Solomon gives the command to commit these plans to God. The word for commit here is more literally translated to roll. It's the same picture that we have when we talk about giving our plans up to, giving our anxieties up to God, pouring out our anxieties, our burdens. It's rolling our burdens over to the Lord. Where we're offering them up completely to Him, rolling off our shoulders onto His. And Solomon says, roll your work, commit your plans to the Lord. Turn your plans over to God. Essentially what it is we're telling God, hey, how about you take the lead? And the beauty is that when we let God take the lead, we see in these verses, our plans will be established. Now that doesn't mean that everything's going to go exactly as we drew it up. On the contrary, it means that we're offering them up to God so that He can make any and all necessary changes. And knowing the omniscient, all-knowing power of God, wouldn't we want Him to take a look at our plans? Consider these verses. I've quoted these oftentimes from behind this pulpit, but they're important. The truth is important for us today. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God is infinitely wiser, infinitely more knowledgeable than we will ever be. And if our infinitely wiser God is going to have the last word, if the answer of the tongue comes from the Lord, it would make sense for us to give our plans to Him and let Him lead us, wouldn't it? So while our hearts and our minds make plans and our plans seem pure and they seem right to us, God is able to look at them and without batting an eye, like a teacher grading an essay, He's able to find all mistakes and all shortcomings. And if your plans are like mine, God comes close to running out of ink on that ink pen as He marks up the plans. And it's not that God is pointing these out, our mistakes and failures, to bring us down, but really it's to prevent us from making deeper mistakes and deeper failures in the future. You see, when we roll our plans over to God, He is able to establish our steps and direct us in a better way. And while the steps won't exactly be what we imagine, we understand that's a good thing because His ways are higher and His thoughts are higher. So as Solomon directs and as Paul lived and understood, knowing all of this, we commit our works to God and He will establish our plans. He will establish our steps. In other words, commit our works to God, because while we make plans, God perfects them. While we make plans, God perfects them. Therefore, if we want to make plans, and some of you said you're not making plans yet, but you're going to eventually for 2019. If we want our 2019 plans to be successful and effective, and let's understand it's not successful and effective for us, but it's all for God's glory, then we ought to commit them to the Lord, who knows the better way and who understands the higher thoughts. And we ought to submit to the changes He makes in our plans, because while we make plans, again, God perfects them. It's exactly what Paul does here. Paul commits his plans to God. He doesn't know exactly what is going to happen. He doesn't know what God's steps are for him next. He doesn't know why the doors are slamming. He doesn't get frustrated and decide to just barrel through. Paul commits his plans to God and waits for the all-knowing God to lead. He waits for God to establish His steps. He waits for God to perfect His plans. And that's exactly what God would do. Go back and read the end of Acts chapter 16, verses 8 through 10. And we find this happens. After a door is slammed and another door is slammed. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man from Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. We make plans and God perfects them. And while door after door was slammed in his face, Paul was looking for that one door, that one open door that God provided. The door to Asia was closed. The door to Bithynia was closed. But through a vision, Paul sees the open door to Macedonia. Paul committed his plans to the Lord and waited for God to establish His steps, waited for God to establish His plans. Paul committed his plans to the Lord, and while he knew the general idea of what he'd be doing, he didn't know every facet. Paul knew, I'm going to be establishing churches, I'm going to be growing churches, I'm going to be spreading the gospel, but he didn't know when, where, or how. All he knew is that God would establish His steps, God would direct His plans. And whatever direction God took Paul was willing to go. You see, Paul was willing to change his plans to align them with God's. He was willing to deviate outside of his plans in order to walk in God's plans. Paul committed his plans to God, and he was willing to change course. And as we make plans for 2019, the question I leave you with today is this: will the same be true for you? Are you or are we willing not only to commit our plans to God, but are we willing to change course from our imperfect plans in order to trade them in for God's perfected plans for us and His perfected plans for His kingdom? If we will, I think we'll find that God's way is better. You see, as we said, we look at Acts chapter 16. We don't really know what would have happened if Paul would have gone into Bithynia, these forbidden areas, and it doesn't matter, because what matters is that Paul chose to walk in the footsteps that God had established. And what we find, it doesn't really might not mean much to us what the idea of Macedonia is. But what we find is that those steps that Paul would go on to follow, the ones that God had laid out for them, would go on to establish churches in familiar cities. You see, because Paul said, you know what, I'm going to deviate, I'm going to change course, I'm going to go in the steps of God, we find churches in cities like Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, and Ephesus, just to name a few. And it was letters to these churches that would make up almost a bulk of what we now call the New Testament. You see, God had plans bigger than Paul could have imagined. Paul just said, I want to go somewhere and tell someone about Jesus. Bithynia looks like a good place. But God had plans bigger than Paul could have imagined, and God had plans better than Paul could have imagined. So while Paul made plans, God perfected them. And I believe that if we'll commit our plans to the Lord for this year, the same will be true for us. That like Paul, as we look back on the plans we made for our lives, we'll be able to see that God's plans are better, that God's plans are bigger and better than anything we could have imagined. And when God is involved, our plans will certainly, most certainly, be more glorifying to Him. So if you're making plans for 2019, which is like a few of you, for the rest of you, here's a hint, you will eventually. Then commit them to the Lord. Don't make them absent from the Lord. Don't make them and then say, okay, God, maybe you can touch up the polish it off and make it look good. Invite Him in the decision-making process. Invite Him in the plan-making process. Commit your plans to the Lord. Because again, while we make plans, God perfects them. God perfects them.